We're going to do post-World War, or we're actually going to do World War II a little bit, and then post-World War II, the Chinese Communist Revolution, and the Cold War for review number 3. As always, watch this video before the designated class block. No excuses. Do any activities. This would be homework number 3. And bring your completed activity and any questions you might have to the next class, and you will have a quiz on this information, which we're calling review number 3. So you're going to look at the end of this video at this really strong historical context. It says revolutions seek to reform political, economic, and social conditions. 3 examples: French Revolution, Chinese Communist Revolution, and the Iranian Revolution. And we'll block this essay at the end. Obviously, we'll focus mostly on the Chinese Communist Revolution in this video. So we've talked about the rise of the dictators before World War II. Of course, not pictured here is Francisco Franco of Spain, the longest serving fascist dictator. Remember, fascism is extreme nationalism. Pictured over here on the left, we have Benito Mussolini of Italy, Hitler of Germany, and of course Joseph Stalin, the only communist that we're going to talk about right this second in the Soviet Union. Key terms. Fascism, of course, is extreme nationalism, and Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler are your 3 fascists that you need to know. The Nuremberg Laws were passed in 1935 by the Nazi regime in Germany and severely restricted the idea of who could be a citizen of Germany. And of course, if you had very small amounts of Jewish ancestry, then you were therefore determined to be a Jew and you had no rights. Then at the Munich Conference of 1938, Hitler had already annexed Austria, and he said to France and England and Italy, I only want a little part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, where 3.5 million people who are German live. And so in 1938, they appeased him. They gave in to the demands of a dictator in order to what they thought was to avoid war, and they just created a bigger monster. And of course, that is appeasement. In the Munich Conference, you should always connect with appeasement. And Hitler takes over the Sudetenland, then all of Czechoslovakia, and then eventually Poland will be invaded, and on September 1st, 1939, starting World War II. At that point, the Nazi-Soviet pact had already been written between Stalin and Hitler, and of course that agreed that, hey, Germany's going to invade Poland from the west, and the Soviet Union will invade Poland from the east, and they'll divide it up. And it was very similar to that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk signed by Lenin at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. The word blitzkrieg, of course, is lightning attack, lightning war by the Nazis. Of course, the horrible Holocaust that many people didn't understand was going on until much too late. And then the Nuremberg trials that brought some Nazi war criminals to justice. There are turning point battles of World War II. Of course, the Battle of Britain, if the British could not have held out, if they didn't survive the nightly bombings of the Nazis, we could be speaking German right now, maybe even Japanese. The British hold out when they are the only country officially fighting the Nazis. Stalingrad is another turning point battle after Hitler breaks the Nazi-Soviet pact and invades the Soviet side of Poland. Of course, the Battle of Stalingrad will be a long siege in which, luckily for us as well, the Soviets ultimately are victorious. And of course, this is also a 2-front war, so this is not really the best idea of fighting that Hitler ever had, and he didn't probably read his history and know that Napoleon also invaded Russia, and that's a bad idea. Of course, we reenacted D-Day. We looked at how that was a turning point to free France and to take over most of Europe for the Allies and for the Soviets to march from the east and the Americans and the Canadians and the British to march from the west and to free and liberate Europe. There are main theaters of World War II. Of course, we focused a lot on the European, a little bit on the North African, and then, of course, the Japanese, where we know that the Japanese had fully industrialized and needed natural resources, and they went into China, into Southeast Asia, and just took what they wanted and hurt people. And the rape of Nanking is one of their examples of their atrocities, and the Bataan Death March of U.S. soldiers is another atrocity. And so we have distinctive battles here showed on this of the war that was truly a world war, including colonial powers, the colonial powers in India, especially fighting on the side of the mother country. Of course, World War II ends with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and August 9th, 1945, and the surrender of the Japanese, ushering in the nuclear age and really ushering in what we would understand as the Cold War. We're going to look at India, Africa, and Middle East more in video 4. Today we're going to look at China and the Cold War in general. So we know that the Cold War is a war of words between the Soviet Union and the United States because of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Winston Churchill said that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, that the Soviets had already occupied at the end of World War II most of Eastern Europe, and they didn't leave. And they pressured the Eastern Europeans to accept and promote communism, even though Stalin promised at the Yalta Conference open and free elections. So the United States, of course, said, well, we have to contain communism. So we used money and influence and aid with the Marshall Plan money to develop Western Europe. And only Western Europe was able to take the Marshall Plan money because you had to stay capitalist and trade with the United States to take the Marshall Plan money. And the Truman Doctrine said that any country threatened by communism would be aided by the United States, and Greece and Turkey were the first two to take that money. And Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, was the last country. Of course, the superpowers are the United States and the Soviet Union. We have escalation and détente throughout the Cold War, up and down. And then we have, Cold War hotspots. The first one is Korea in 1950, when North Korea invades South Korea in an attempt to make all of Korea communist. It's the first United Nations action, and it is a win for containment in that North stays communist and South stays capitalist. And today, of course, we see policies and issues arising from North Korea still remaining a communist country, led by Kim Jong-un. Then the second is, of course, the Vietnam War, which lasts roughly from 1954 to 1975, in which communism was not contained. The leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, is able to unite all of Vietnam into one communist country that it is today, with some capitalism. Cuba is the first country in the Western Hemisphere, very close to Florida, that is going to become communist. Fidel Castro is the leader of the Communist Revolution in Cuba, and he allies quickly with the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev. And this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets had put missile launching sites into Cuba and very much making us vulnerable to nuclear attack. President Kennedy, our president at the time, ordered a naval blockade around Cuba, and Nikita Khrushchev sent his ships towards our blockade, and it was an elaborate game of chicken in which Nikita Khrushchev backs off. World War III is avoided. It was the closest we ever come to World War III. Brinkmanship is the word for it. And luckily, war is avoided. We get our nuclear missiles out of Turkey. Soviet Union gets its nuclear missile launching sites out of Cuba. And we have an easing of tensions for a little bit. And then in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and that lasts until 1989. And that's the Soviets' Vietnam. We aid the freedom fighters against the communists, and the Soviets tried to make Afghanistan communism, but that's just not always possible, and Afghanistan falls to an Islamic extremist group called the Taliban after that, a government that is horribly strict to both men and women in Afghanistan, and we topple that while we are searching for Osama bin Laden in 2001. Détente is that word here, of course, an easing of tensions, and of course we have countries that decide not to be aligned with either the Soviet Union or the United States. They're called non-aligned countries. Two examples are India and Pakistan. Another example of détente is SALT I and SALT II. Those are strategic arms limitation treaties where the United States and the Soviet Union decide to limit the amount of nuclear warheads that both countries use and have. In China, right after World War II, we have a civil war between Jiang Jieshi and Mao Zedong, and Mao wins. He had already gotten the peasants' support by taking them on a 6,000-long journey called the Long March. And so in the Civil War, he gains more of the peasants' support, which is the biggest, group of the population then and now. And so he tells them, hey, we're going to take a great leap forward. And he institutes something that's very similar to Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans. And he says to the people in China, melt down all of your pots and pans and metal instruments, go make some steel, go make huge amounts of food. People join communes, there's lots of propaganda and competition. It leads to about 30 million people dying of famine. And instead of changing course, Mao Zedong says, well, you know what we need to do? We just need to change people's thoughts. And so in 1966 starts the Cultural Revolution, a time of more death, more destruction, huge amounts of propaganda, the Red Guards, Mao's Little Red Book, and of course we saw that in the movie To Live, and we saw The Great Leap Forward as well, and just the propaganda machine that's huge. When Mao dies in 1976, a new leadership comes to power under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, and he introduces the 4 modernizations and says, we're going to modernize industry and medicine and science and farming and the military. And he allows for some private ownership, some capitalism. Students feel that there should be some participation in the government and some democracy. And so in 1989, we see student protests throughout the country, in particular in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And unfortunately, Deng Xiaoping orders the protesters to be taken out of their protest area in Tiananmen Square by force, through tear gas, through bullets. And we know it as the Tiananmen Square Uprising and the Tiananmen Square Massacre. At the end of the Soviet Union, we of course have Mikhail Gorbachev and his ideas of perestroika and glasnost. By 1989, those are words that Americans are saying. Perestroika is a restructuring of the economy, more capitalism. Glasnost is open criticism of the government, which are two things that the Soviet Union hadn't had. So the Soviet Union's the first communist country and to exist, and the first one to fall. And the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, taken down literally by East and West Berliners to open up East and West Berlin, and then eventually by 1991, the unification of Germany. We also have behind the Iron Curtain the Prague Spring of Czechoslovakia, and they wanted to throw off communism in Czechoslovakia. And then Lech Walesa in Poland and his solidarity movement that wanted to throw off communism and be able to practice Roman Catholicism in Poland. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev can't afford to control the satellite nations of the Soviet Union's Eastern European satellite nations anymore. And so he says, all right, you're on your own. And that leads to the fall of communism, the metaphorical Iron Curtain being lifted, and the end of the Cold War. It doesn't mean all the troubles are over, unfortunately, because the end of the Cold War then ushers in this Yugoslavia. What's going to happen in Yugoslavia? And the Serbs want to keep the Bosnians together as one country. And a leader named Slobodan Milosevic, written here, says we need to clean this area of ethnically of Muslims, and because of the Ottoman Empire's influence, there were many Muslims in the Balkan region, and unfortunately this leads to the Bosnian genocide. So when one thing changes, it leaves an opening for horrific things. Ethnic cleansing, concentration camps. Here are the pictures of people being liberated from those camps. The United Nations is established after World War II, and it is a peacekeeping organization, but it's really a problem-solving organization in order to try to solve problems before they escalate and before countries feel the need to use violence more or at all. And so they have different groups, economic groups, peace groups, development groups, human rights groups, drug control groups, nuclear groups, justice groups, humanitarian groups, medical groups, a lot of those. And so the United Nations is a very important organization that tries to help people before things get worse. If they need to take action, they will. Please do not confuse the United Nations with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a military alliance headed by the United States and her allies. The Warsaw Pact was a military alliance between the Soviet Union and its satellites. It is no longer in existence today. The European Union, we talked about the euro and how former enemies come and they become economic allies. And the two first economic allies actually are Western Germany, this is during the Cold War, and France, and they form a steel and coal community. Today we have the European Union and member nations, almost all of them have one common currency called the euro, which makes trade, jobs, all of that very much more efficient. Today we have Britain leaving the European Union, and the short name for that is called Brexit, which is a real form of economic nationalism that the English are showing. Instead of globalization, they would like to take care of their own economic issues without being tied to other countries. And again, that's economic nationalism versus globalization. The European Union is an example of globalization. The United Nations is a form of globalization. Pulling back from trade agreements is economic nationalism. Let's do some practice. Mao Zedong gained support of the peasants through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Long March, or the Little Red Book. Of course, that long march, 6,000 miles, get them to safety during the troubles that they were having. He becomes a hero. Stalin industrialized and mass-produced food through the 5-year plans, collective farms. Mao attempted to industrialize China and produce great amounts of food with his Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, Long March, or the Little Red Book. Of course, the answer is the Great Leap Forward. During this period, Mao Zedong used propaganda and his Red Guards to enforce his ideas. Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, Long March, or the Little Red Book. That's the Cultural Revolution, of course. In Eastern Europe during the 50s and 60s, early Cold War, the Soviet Union responded to challenges to its control. Did it allow free elections when necessary, imposing prompt and severe repression, obtaining United Nations assistance, or granting independence to its satellite nations? Of course, imposing prompt and severe repression. Repression means to shut down any sort of dissent, any sort of disagreement. Which headline concerning the Soviet Union refers to a Cold War event? Yeltsin assumes power, that's the guy after Gorbachev. Trotsky forms the Red Army, that's the guy around Stalin-Lenin time. Germany invades the Soviet Union, or the Warsaw Pact formed. Of course, it is the Warsaw Pact formed. That is that alliance by the Soviet Union and the satellite nations. One similarity between Lenin's new economic policy and Gorbachev's policy of perestroika is that both policies support collectivization of farms, allowed some aspects of capitalism in the Soviet Union, increased citizen participation in the Soviet government, strengthened governmental control over the Soviet republics. Of course, the answer is capitalism, capitalism, capitalism. Lenin and Gorbachev are similar in that way, Lenin being the first communist leader to introduce capitalism and Gorbachev to be the last. From the perspective of the North Vietnamese, the war in Vietnam in the 60s was a battle between, was it fascism and liberalism, nationalism and imperialism, republicanism and totalitarianism, theocracy and monarchy? Nationalism, imperialism. My two biggest picks for topics for thematic essays. The creation of the United Nations, the expansion of the European Community, European Union, and the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement resulted in an increase in political revolutions, non-alignment policies, military alliances, or international cooperations. These are all positive things in international cooperations, at least for economic cooperation. Since the end of the Cold War, Cuba has experienced the loss of a major source of its foreign financial support, increased economic growth from expanded trade, expanded political influence in Latin American affairs, or greater independence from Communist China. Now think about this. It's the end of the Cold War. Who's gone? The Soviet Union. So the answer, of course, is a loss of major source of its foreign financial support from the Soviet Union. Economic development in Latin American nations has been hindered. Hindered means stopped or slowed, most by a scarcity of goods produced for trade and a lack of natural resources, governments that are primarily concerned with preserving the environment, problems of overpopulation, patterns of land distribution, and a lack of investment capital, corporations that are not interested in the use of modern tech. Of course, overpopulation, land distribution, investment capital. A study of the accident at Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union and the severe air pollution in Mexico City would lead to the conclusion that technology can cause problems throughout the world, international trade is more profitable than domestic commerce, modern science cannot solve most political problems, agricultural nations have caused major world environmental problems. Tech, tech, tech. Here is our essay again. Revolutions. Discuss the political, economic, and social causes of two of these revolutions. You can pick French, Chinese, or Iranian. Compare and contrast the results of these two revolutions. Evaluate the extent to which these two revolutions accomplish their goals of reform. And of course, you're supposed to block these on your homework. Again, you're looking at Revolution 1 and Revolution 2, outside and inside information because these were DBQs, political and social and economic causes, results, and if the goals were achieved, even if there was an attempt and it wasn't achieved well. My best bets for you all would be the French and the Chinese. We did discuss the Iranian Revolution, but only quickly. And I, of course, want you to understand the basics of the Iranian Revolution, but we delve deep into the French Revolution and the Chinese Communist Revolution. That's the whole deal with Mao. It's called many things: the Chinese Revolution, Mao's Revolution, post-World War II China. It's the same idea. All right, good luck. See you later.